Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is your host, Webster Tarpley, speaking to you from Washington, D.C., where we are fighting the battle for free speech and the First Amendment against the liberticide efforts of the dark forces in the country at large. We are First Amendment Radio. We stand for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and without those, the other freedoms, the whole rest of the Bill of Rights is absolutely up in the air. We also invite people to support me, this broadcast, and the entire effort by going to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv, and there you will find a way to subscribe to a daily radio broadcast. Right now it's Monday through Thursday, shortly to be expanded. But with that, you'll be getting yours truly 5 days a week. And that means updates that we can't handle on a weekly program like this. So I urge you to keep going with both, because that is what I hope to do and what I think is the optimum solution. Now, we have to talk about Syria, the Syrian ceasefire. The immediate news is that the Syrian ceasefire is holding, but there are significant problems. And among these significant problems, we have the fact that the so-called Free Syrian Army, in reality, a group of thinly veiled, thinly disguised terrorists, including Takfiris and Salafis and other extremist, violent elements. The Free Syrian Army has been trying to sabotage this truce, the truce having been worked out between U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian Federation Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov last weekend in Geneva. We'll have some stories about that too. But the word coming from the Russian side during the last couple of days is that elements of this Free Syrian Army and similar groups have been attempting to use the ceasefire illegally, illegitimately, in ways that are expressly forbidden in the deal, we think, because we don't have the deal. The deal is still confidential. They've been using this the so-called moderate opposition, and again, that's this Free Syrian Army and people like that. They're using the cessation of hostilities to regroup and indeed to increase attacks on residential areas. And I have here the communique from TASS, the official Russian government news agency. And what they're complaining about is that the Pentagon has not been separating the so-called moderate opposition, who are not going to be bombed, at least for the moment, from the Nusra Brigade, which is fair game and could be bombed by both powers, by Russia and the United States. So the Russians point to 39 episodes of shelling at Syrian government troops, 19 in the province of Aleppo, 16 in Latakia, 6 Damascus, 5 Hama, 1 from Homs. This is Mr. Savchenko, Vladimir Savchenka, making this report at the Russian Defense Ministry, or Center for Reconciliation of the Warring Parties in Syria, I guess it actually is. Most attention now focuses on the Castello Road, north of Aleppo. Right? Aleppo, because of its size, because of the dramatic humanitarian condition, Aleppo is the center of attention, and unfortunately, it looks like, according to, the U.S. side is alleging that the trucks, the convoys, the United Nations humanitarian aid operation have not received any safe conducts, any permits from the Assad government, right? This is Jan Egeland in Geneva, Syrian Humanitarian Task Force chairman. He says we could get humanitarian aid in today, but we're not going because the permits have not been given. Not a single permit is in the hands of our people. So we have two sides. There's also the claim that the Syrian government forces along this famous Castello Road, which is now the cynosure of world attention, that they're being pulled back. The Russian side says that the Syrian Arab army is pulling back from its positions along the road, and therefore the trucks should be able to start soon. But with this, time is of the essence. Now, we have now reached the end of the second of these truce periods. It's divided into 48-hour chunks. So one went from sundown Monday to sundown Wednesday. From sundown Wednesday to sundown Friday is the second one. And we're now going into the third 48-hour chunk. And here the Russian side has officially proposed to the United States that there be another 48 hours. And that is what should happen, obviously, right? All we need now is one more 48-hour period plus a 24-hour period, just 3 days, a weekend. And then we can proceed to the creation of the much-needed JIG, the Joint Integration Group, which is now being studied and prepared by the Russian Defense Ministry, Foreign Ministry, and their counterparts on the U.S. side. And that would then allow joint U.S. and Russian airstrikes against ISIS and Nusra. And that is the imperative for the peace of the world, to promote cooperation between the two superpowers against the most obvious terrorist threat, against the people who have been blowing up targets in Belgium and in France and quite possibly in the United States and in Russia and in other places, right? In Tunisia, you name it. So this is what has to happen. And we want, in order to make this happen, in other words, in order to validate it and give it the moral authority it needs in the eyes of the world, the humanitarian aid convoys of trucks must roll down that Castello Road. Sergei Kapitsin, senior officer of the Russian group in Aleppo, says Syrian government forces have pulled their heavy weapons away from the demilitarized. Well, they've moved them because of the attacks by the militants, and that part of that had to use the Castello Road. But the goal is for the Castello Road to be a demilitarized zone. So the Russian side says intense fire from firearms and mortars was conducted at the Syrian government troops near the Castello Road during the past night. 2 Syrian servicemen severely wounded. But now let's get to the heart of the matter. There's a great deal of stuff that has to be done. But the problem is we have factions in the U.S. government. And this is now the gist of an article here on the front page of the Washington Post in the upper left-hand corner. Behind the Syrian deal, a mistrust of Russia. And here we learn what we had suspected. As of last Saturday to Sunday, we had this negotiation between Lavrov and Kerry in Geneva. And we know that Kerry had to get on the teleconference with Washington and convince people. And who those people are, we will tell you here in just a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Radio. You want to support me in my fight for the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom from the press? I'm the only target in the U.S. so far on the big issue, right? Is the presidential campaign going to be conducted through the courts or in the court of public opinion? And that's AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. Please go there. We're gaining in subscribers. We're gaining in influence. You should be a part of it. Give me your help, and you won't regret it. You'll still be able to speak your mind over the next 4 years or more, or whatever it is. And this goes in all directions. I mean, freedom of speech is indivisible. And if you don't have it, you can forget the Second Amendment, the Fourth, the 10th, whatever your favorite is. You won't be able to defend those because you will be muzzled. So don't let that happen here in the United States. Now, we have factions in the federal government, and the head of the what can we say, the retrograde faction, if you want to push it, the sabotage faction, is Ashton Carter. We've seen this before. Ashton B. Carter, the ill-chosen Secretary of Defense at this point in the Pentagon, was the guy who kept Kerry blocked and essentially, poleaxed, paralyzed for 2 to 3 hours on this international conference call, teleconference, along with other officials. And what Kerry had to wait for was for the Defense Department had to locate its legal counsel, a lawyer, to sign off on one of the many provisions that Defense Secretary Ashton Carter was questioning. Now, you'd wonder, why wouldn't Obama be in that room to break the logjam right away? Since if he cares about his legacy, he wants the Democratic ticket to win, and one way to make sure they win is to put an end successfully to the Syrian war. That would cut off a whole lot of Republican anti-ISIS demagoguery if we had the Syrian civil war over, that is between the so-called moderate opposition, whoever they are. They don't exist. Moderate opposition is in the Syrian parliament in Damascus. If you're out in the countryside with a Kalashnikov, you're probably a terrorist. But end this by October 31st, right? End it by Halloween. End it by early November. And that Republican demagoguery about ISIS falls to the ground. So that is what is essential. It was their domestic political reasons. There are other reasons. You want to do something to help to alleviate the European refugee crisis? Well, put an end to the Syrian war, and those people can turn around. Those are all valid considerations, not these legal technicalities that seem to mean so much to Ashton Carter over there in the Pentagon. Now, here's the way it goes. It's Ashton Carter is dragging his feet. General Joseph L. Votel, V-O-T-E-L, the head of the U.S. Central Command, said on Wednesday, there is a trust deficit with the Russians. It's mutual, General. It's mutual. You've got to take confidence-building measures and not go popping off in the press like this, shooting your mouth off. Would Eisenhower have done this? I don't know. Well, MacArthur might have, but he wouldn't have done it in this way. So this General Votel says there is a trust deficit with the Russians. It is not clear to us what their objectives are. They want to support the Assad government, the legal, internationally recognized government. There's no mystery about that. They say one thing, and we don't necessarily see them following up on this. Well, that's mutual too. Now, the distrust is deepest in this Ashton Carter, this useless pedant whose tenure in office has been marred by a $1 billion program that produced 5 fighters who immediately joined the worst terrorist faction. And of course, today, if you look at Russia today, take a look. This is where they come in handy. There's a group of U.S. special forces that were in a Syrian town, I think north of Aleppo, precisely this critical Castello Road area. U.S. military, active duty, special forces, they were there in the midst of the Free Syrian Army, and the Free Syrian Army threatened to kill them. The Free Syrian Army threatens to kill U.S. troops, and they had to skedaddle. They had to hightail it out of there. They had to get in their jeeps and vehicles and get out. This is what we get for $1 billion wasted on the Free Syrian Army under the auspices of Ashton Carter, who is so concerned about every legal point, but doesn't have the general political situation correct. Now, What does the uniformed military think, right? Not these pedants, right? Not these defense intellectuals of the Rand Corporation, type, or the Herman Kahn variety. Let's ask General Joseph F. Dunford. This is, I think, a Marine Corps general, D-U-N-F-O-R-D, right? This is now the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He voiced little objection, few objections, right? No objection to this arrangement. And then we have these cover stories. Pentagon officials acknowledged widespread concern that Russia will not live up to its end of the deal, and they fear the U.S. military will be blamed for problems or the failure of an initiative it does not fully support. And they are still smarting from criticism and derision over an earlier program to build up an army of U.S.-trained Syrian fighters that repeatedly stumbled, became a mockery, and then was ultimately abandoned, right, says the Washington Post. Kerry's argument is you can be wary of Russian intervention, sure, trust but verify, fine, but there is no other way to stop the civil war in Syria and make sure that the emphasis is kept or shifted to the far more important battle against the Islamic State, and without U.S. ground troops, which Obama has rejected and which Mrs. Clinton has also rejected. So, interview by Kerry with National Public Radio. What is the alternative? The alternative is to have more people killed, 450,000 if that's the figure, and then how many thousands more, largely killed by these foreign fighters, Takfiris brought in by Saudi Arabia. The Russians and the Syrians are waging war, so why don't you, do something rather than just sit there? And if you're not going to have U.S. ground forces, which we're not, we are sick of war, and we have a readily available alternative. There's the Syrian Arab Army is capable and eager and willing to fight. Therefore, this has to go through. Now, is Obama aware that there are these factions in his administration? Well, here's what Josh Earnest, the White House spokesman, said, I think yesterday. He says the president, Obama, is quote, entirely confident. I'll give you the quote on the other side of the break. But it looks like he's aware that there are factions in this administration. So now's the time to ask for Ashton Carter's resignation. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Requesting your kind attendance at AmericanSystem.tv. That's a daily, up-to-date internet radio podcast, I guess. And it's up-to-date, it's hard-hitting, and it's lively, and you can get it every day. So if you're disappointed by various internet radio programs and the like, which have sold themselves in a Faustian bargain, come to listen to yours truly at AmericanSystem.tv. Now, the factions. Let's just get back to this issue. Is Obama aware? So, Washington Post reports there are reports of internal administration clashes, and after the Kerry deal with Lavrov went through, the Pentagon statement said we will be watching the Russians to make sure they comply. The White House response on Wednesday was Obama likes different opinions. He's not looking for a bunch of people that have the same exact opinion, close quote. Josh Earnest then adds, quote, Obama is entirely confident that once he's made a decision, he can count on the members of his team to execute that strategy with excellence. I would say, Obama, get yourself into the room. Don't let Ashton Carter hold up this absolutely essential, absolutely critical initiative for 3 hours or any other time period, right? If Ashton Carter wants to dissent, he should leave the administration and do so from the sidelines. Ashton Carter seems to have gotten the message on Wednesday in Austin. He says, quote, we in the Defense Department will play whatever role we have with our accustomed excellence. So thank you. Thanks for congratulating yourselves. Washington Post notes that Trump claims that Obama doesn't listen to his generals, but in reality, quote, it is the generals who have been the most averse, the most against a direct role for the U.S. in this civil war. And they say Martin Dempsey of the Joint Chiefs of Staff tried to block every idea for bombing, no-fly zone, whatever it was. He was throwing himself under the bus in front of every idea that came out. There's a great deal of resistance. Now, there's an unnamed guy in the Pentagon who says any collusion with Russia has a lot of enemies in the Pentagon. There's a reluctance to intervene, and this collusion with what? Collusion, what is this? Makes it worse. Now, the perspective, of course, is the JIG, the Joint Intelligence Group. This will be located, we think, in Jordan. U.S. and Russian officials will discuss and agree on legitimate targets and determine which country is best situated to launch airstrikes against them. Yes, that's what we need. The U.S. Central Command, U.S. European Command, Dunford's office at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Pentagon intelligence groups are working the details of how the Joint Integration Center with personnel, logistics, surveillance information, and so forth would be set up. And there is this catch that the Congress, in its infinite wisdom, has inserted a block. You can't cooperate with Russia unless the defense secretary issues a waiver and tells Congress why it's in the interest of the U.S. to cooperate with Russia. Well, Ashton, you better do that, or you better not come back to your office, right? Because this is simply intolerable. This has got to go through, and it's got to be successful. There was already a quibble that when the U.S. and Russia last September made that deconfliction agreement to avoid air crashes and things like that, when the Russian Air Force moved in to that base on the Mediterranean near Latakia, there was a question then, but this time it might well be triggered. So that's a big issue. So I would say people get busy on social media. There's a domestic political reason for this. It's just like Farragut going into Mobile in August of 1864 and Sherman going into Atlanta in September of 1864. This would clear the air for the U.S. election, and you all know exactly what I mean. Now, concerning my humble self, I'm taking my stand on the First Amendment. I'm taking my stand on freedom of speech and freedom of the press. I'm also very interested in the Saint-Amant decision of the Supreme Court in 1968. If I didn't have so much news, I would read you parts of that. And I will be reading it on the American System this coming week. Think of me, if you will, as the canary in the coal mine. I'm the canary in the coal mine. You know what it is, right? You take a bird down into a mine, and if the bird keels over, then you know that you got some problems with poison gas or whatever it is. There's a problem with the air in the coal mine. So when it comes to the First Amendment, I am sort of the canary in the coal mine. Just me alone in that sense. I am being targeted, and be aware of it. And again, if you want to contribute to helping me to continue this fight, then AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv. Sign up. You can sign up to be an activist, right? One thing is the subscription to get the broadcast 4 days a week, shortly 5 days a week. And if you pay a little bit more, then you become an official sponsor of the political activism that goes with it. So we are in the midst of a big chill. It's not universal. There are some people who are resisting, but there is a chilling effect. So let's just look at the First Amendment in general, right? The Republican campaign is saying, oh, there are these requests for all kinds of revelations about taxes, health, and so forth. And the answer from them is people don't care, only the enemies care. we can't reveal that. The argument is actually quite singular. It says we can't reveal that information because it might be damaging. In other words, you can look forward to a society now where oligarchs decide what can be known. It's like a version of the Official Secrets Act, but this is the Official Secrets Act in the private sector to try to block reporting. This is MK, right? This is MK beyond MK. So I have always, and people can remember this antedates any of the particular personalities now on the scene. In the nuclear age, if you want to get your hand on the nuclear button, if you want to get control of the nuclear launch codes, then the public has the absolute right to know everything but everything about you. This is not as of today. This was my view in 1988, in 1992, and continuously. Right? This is my principle. The public has a right to know everything about your family, about your dogs, about your pets, your cats, your girlfriend, your car, whatever it is. Everything. Nothing can be excluded. Because if there's anything problematic, any aspect which has not been thoroughly illuminated, this can become the stuff of blackmail by intelligence services. And it doesn't even have to be hostile intelligence services. It just has to be, or it can certainly be, intelligence services. The friendly ones want to blackmail you as much as the other ones, right? And it's always done, and you want to avoid it. So therefore, it is a merciless scrutiny of all of these points that serves the public interest. And we'll be back in just a second on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio, now serving as your first line of defense of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, and freedom of the press. And this is your friendly canary in the coal mine, here in the middle of a big chill. So the bottom line on this stuff about what should be revealed, everything, without exception. Medical records, sure. Mental health records, yes. If you have a foundation, and we see that they do, that too. How about your transcript, right? That would have been, important. Today the big news is all about Trump now proclaims that Obama was born in the United States. That cuts in a number of ways, but I think Obama would have been well advised to issue the entire thing very early on, put out the long form birth certificate before it became an issue. Don't let it become an issue. Just put it out. All routine. No honor, no macho stuff, no false modesty or anything like that. Just put it all out. Sunshine is the disinfectant. And this would be, going back 25, 30 years, certainly, if your political career goes back that far. Otherwise, what you have, again, is oligarchs who are telling the public what they can know and what they can't know. And I would urge people not to support, in other words, people who hide everything or much, right? So one of the ways you can decide who to vote for is factor in which candidate is more opaque and which is more transparent. So we have democracy in crisis. Now, today in the Washington Post, we have a continuation of the problem of warmongering, hawkishness, militarism, the preference for military solutions, as well as regime change, activism, and so forth on the part of Hillary Clinton, right? That Clinton voted wrong on Iraq. She calls it my mistake, but she's never said what it was methodologically, epistemologically that led her to that wrong mistake. Concerning Libya, she still defends her warmongering on Libya, and unfortunately, she still has in her campaign the idea of a no-fly zone over Syria, which means a 3-week bombing campaign and likely clash with Russia and all of the incalculable, tragic, useless, pointless consequences, right? The big problem in the U.S. Washington bureaucracy is this obsession with regime change against the Assad government of Syria. This must stop. This must be repudiated. And, we've seen the Republican candidate thinks if some sailor on an Iranian patrol boat thumbs his nose at the U.S. destroyer, then you start shooting. Now, that's even worse. That, I think, is even worse. But the stuff with Hillary is obviously not good. So in order to be prepared for everything, you got to be prepared with some kind of an approach to trying to box her in and prevent this. So the idea is that she was impressed by the genocides in Rwanda and in the Balkans. Now, Rwanda, I don't have the whole story on Rwanda, but I do know, having talked to a diplomat from nearby country during that time in the mid-90s, there was a lot of role of the Belgian government, right? The Belgian government has done some terrible things in Africa, in the Congo in the early 60s. And apparently this Rwanda-Burundi, there was a lot of very provocative and unclear things coming from Belgium. And concerning the Balkans, well, we know that all the European powers were competing, the Germans on the side of the Croatians, the French and the British on the side of the Serbs, although they couldn't avow that. This was the alliance going back to World War I. So that was, 800,000 people killed in Rwanda, if that's the correct figure. And Hillary Clinton and Holbrooke in those days thought that selective airstrikes were the only way to stop the genocide in Bosnia. Now, possibly a case for airstrikes to lift the siege of Sarajevo. Okay, but not, repeat, not the bombing of Serbia around the Kosovo issue, 1999. So you're talking about an arc of about 5 or 6 years. There's also what happened with the Black Hawk Down in October 1993. And already Hillary Clinton was profiling as somebody who was pushing for military action. Operation Desert Fox. This was right before Christmas, 1998, around mid-December. And bombing, right? So bad news. Then 1999, as we said, the bombing of Kosovo, that is one of the greatest acts of historical vandalism in recent years. She says, I urged Bill to bomb. I supported him. No, sorry. She was much impressed by Elie Wiesel, this book called The Perils of Indifference. She found that convincing as applied to modern politics. After 9/11, she said she was supporting George W. Bush, and then it became Iraq and regime change. And she often went back to Clinton-era legislation saying that Saddam Hussein had to be overthrown. Saddam Hussein has to be overthrown is rhetoric, right? As rhetoric, I don't agree. But the point is, trying to do it is a different story. And these are not on the same level. And Hillary allowed herself to be duped by Condoleezza Rice, that it was just the permission to use military force was to allow Bush to go to the UN or do other things. Now, she says that she was duped by Condoleezza. And then there's this famous story of a secret report that undercut the Bush case that had been touted by Bob Graham, Democrat of Florida, he of the 28 pages. When it came to the vote on Iraq, Senator Edward Kennedy was trying to be the anti-war whip, and he figured that Hillary was so far gone that he didn't even talk to her. And, by the time it got to be October 2002, Hillary voted for the Iraq war. That was a 77-23 vote. Her vote was not decisive, but it shows a flawed way of thinking. And again, I say to her, if you want to humanize yourself, right, if you want to convince people that you're actually a viable candidate, Hillary, you've got to talk about what misled you. Because now she says, no U.S. ground troops in Iraq, no U.S. ground troops in Syria, not on my watch. Okay, what have you learned? Not just facts, but the way of thinking, right, about the Constitution, about large-scale strategy, and all those similar things. Now, that's the Washington Post. Now, also, the Washington Post and the New York Times have both concluded in long articles that Mrs. Clinton was the person who pushed the U.S. into this ill-advised, catastrophic war in Libya, which was, of course, a creature of the British and the French, Operation Harmattan, which was a secret treaty signed in London in the fall of 2010 that the two countries were going to act together, because they have to, in order to knock off a large North African country with oil. We want to call everybody's attention to the cover story of Newsweek this week. It's Kurt Eichenwald has done yeoman service in writing about the Trump networks, the Trump business empires, and the unavoidable and labyrinthine conflicts of interest to which this would expose the United States government in the event that, well, the unthinkable happens. One of them, I can't go through all of his examples. He's been on television. He was on I guess it was the day before yesterday. He was on television practically continuously the whole day. Virtually every MSNBC program, some CNN programs, and so forth. So this has gotten a lot of airing, and he promises more revelations. He promises things that touch Trump in different ways. I'll just give you one of the examples here in just a minute when we come back on World Crisis Radio. Welcome the second hour of a World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C., thanking you all for your kind attention and urging your attention be extended to AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, 4-day week, shortly 5, update, 1 full hour on what's going on in the world, where I can go into details that can't be accommodated in this program, right? Ample though this is. So please go to AmericanSystem.tv. And I am your first line of defense for the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. I am, if you will, that famous canary in the coal mine. And if you see me go down, then you'll know that the First Amendment has essentially been shredded, and that that's a process that will touch every person on the territory and around the world, in the jurisdiction and far beyond. So remember, the Supreme Court, as of 1964, was in favor of a robust public debate, especially in presidential campaigns, and more so now because of the intercontinental ballistic missiles with hydrogen bomb warheads, which a president can control. This is the big issue. From Goldwater till now, it's the same, and it's become more acute because in those days, as you saw with Dr. Strangelove, there were actually bombers that could, turn around if they needed to. But now it's far beyond that. So the Newsweek cover story, again, Kurt Eichenwald doing yeoman service, an important public service, writing about the worldwide business empire of the Trumps. And I urge you you can buy. There are print copies. They may not be easy to find or read it, but this is something that deserves some support, certainly your attention. Let me just give you one sample. Now, this is about one of the hundreds of relations that the Republican candidate has. And let me just quote. I'm quoting from Eichenwald, right? This is just a paragraph. This is one of several examples that he gives. Quote, another business relationship, meaning by Trump, right? Another business relationship that could raise concerns about conflicts involves Azerbaijan, a country the State Department said in an official report was, quote, was infused with, quote, corruption and predatory behavior by politically connected elites, close quote. According to Trump's financial filings, the Republican nominee is the president of two entities called OT Marks Baku LLC and DT Marks Baku Manayana Member Corporation. Those were established as part of deals that the Trump organization made last year for a real estate project in the country's capital. The partner in the deal is Garant Holding, which is controlled by Anar Mammadov, Mammadov. Anar Mammadov, the son of the country's transportation minister. And the minister, the latter, is Ziya, Z-I-Y-A, Mammadov. Again, M-A-M-M-A-D-O-V. According to American diplomatic cables made public in 2010, the United States possessed information that led diplomats to believe Ziya Mammadov laundered money for the Iranian military. No formal charges have been brought against either Mammadov, close quote. Now, we're not here to demonize the Iranian military, but like everything else, the public has a right to know. The public must be informed. There must be robust public debate on the basis of a factual substratum, which is as good as it can be, right? As complete, as thorough, as reliable. So that's it in a nutshell, right? This is what would be needed. Now, as we've been talking for the past couple of months, right? The U.S. election will be decided in many ways by internal factors, right? By the performance of the candidates and their responses to other events. But there are big outside events that will also shape the outcome, set the stage, influence, to some degree determine. The three big outside factors, and it's been growing now, one is this Syrian situation. If a successful ceasefire and a successful joint U.S.-Russian clobbering of ISIS and Nusra can be arranged, then the chances of the Democratic ticket improve significantly. The second is the question of voting rights, and what we've seen is that in 4 or 5 states, we don't need to go through them, but the courts, the U.S. federal courts, the federal circuit courts of appeals, and unfortunately the Supreme Court, have generally been able to at least reduce, to check the attempt to take people's votes away. The big exception being that Ohio will now be able to cut its early voting days by about 6 or 7 days. But I think even there, this is not a fatal defeat because there are enough early voting days to allow people to vote. And I think that's also part of the court ruling, although I don't agree with the court ruling. And then there's this question of ballot initiatives. You'll remember Karl Rove in 2004 wanting to get reactionaries to come to the polls to vote for George W. Bush. Karl Rove put these anti-gay rights referenda on the state ballot saying, well, they might not come out for my candidate, George W. Bush, right, Dubia, but these reactionaries will come out to vote against gay rights. And that was one of the big factors that made this possible. So now what we have is a large number of left-leaning ballot initiatives, a large number. And of course, these are a mixed bag. The ones that interest us the most are the minimum wage ballot issues. Pay attention now. Listen for your state or jurisdiction and get ready to vote yourself a raise, right? Because if you increase the minimum wage to $15, the entire wage structure of that jurisdiction is moved up. It helps everybody. It is a rising tide that lifts all boats. So right now, the referenda aiming at a minimum wage of $15 an hour or something similar, I'm not sure of the exact amount in all these states, that is going on in California. Important. Missouri. Oregon has a minimum wage referendum. Ohio has one. Ohio, come out and vote yourself a raise. This allows you to vote for something you want without having to vote for the Democratic Party, which some people find unacceptable. Ohio in 2011 defeated Kasich on this anti-labor referendum. And they were able to do that because they didn't have the Democratic Party as the beneficiary. You'll notice in Wisconsin, when they tried to get rid of the governor, Scott Walker, it failed because this guy they had, the mayor of Milwaukee, was not acceptable to so many people. So this takes the Democratic Party out of the equation. These referenda are a way to outflank the Republicans in their control of the governorships and the state legislature. You also outflank the Democrats. You don't have to put up with some loony leftist or whatever you might find. So again, referenda to raise the minimum wage. California, Missouri, Oregon, Ohio, Maine, District of Columbia. How about that? In Arkansas, you can vote to make it obligatory for people who put political advertising on the television and radio. They have to tell where the money came from. In Nevada, if you're concerned about guns, you can vote for a background check, very mild kind of stuff. In Colorado, if you don't like toxic events, you can vote against fracking. And in 8 states, I'm not going to go through them all, in 8 states you can vote for the legalization of marijuana. So surely there's something for everybody. We'll be back in a minute on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here, your First Amendment defender, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. If that's what you want, I'm your guy. Please go to americansystem.tv, americansystem.tv. Now, Trump's economics at the Waldorf Astoria for the Economic Club of New York this week. The irony of the Republican campaign is the personnel, a lot of them go back to Nixon, but the economics seem to go back to Reagan, and this is not good. This is the supply side theory. This is trickle-down economics. This is what George H.W. Bush called voodoo economics, voodoo. This is the land of dynamic scoring. And, this is what we're getting. So this is what came out of the teleprompter. It's Reaganomics. And it's a failure. I'm sorry. It's a failure, and we'll go through now a couple of the points. Now, I gave what I thought was pretty much an exhaustive point-by-point presentation and commentary on the Trump Waldorf Astoria economic speech. I gave that on the American System, I think yesterday. But now let's just do some commentary, and I want to compare it also to what happened under Reagan, because this is also important for a lot of people. Reaganomics. So the modern Reaganomics is take the top rate for wage earners and reduce that from about 39 or 40% to this is the federal corporate income tax. Federal corporate income tax in Trump's proposal, which he calls the business tax. It is the federal corporate income tax, would go from 35% to 15%. That's a 20% tax bonanza for banks, Wall Street, all these financial services operations, right? This is a huge shifting of the tax burden off the backs of the financial industry. It also works, I guess, for GM and people like that, but it's a measure that ultimately gets you nowhere. The problem being that if you put more money into the treasuries of these corporations, they will generally not build modern plant and equipment and hire new workers to create economic prosperity by commodity production, tangible physical wealth, and so forth. That's not what you're going to get. You're going to get them going out and buying more derivatives. They're going to speculate in a bubble market, which I think would be the thing coming out of Trump's measures. Trump also wants to take the top individual income tax rate for individuals, single, married, from 40% down to 33%. It's a 7% increase, but 7% off the very top leads to gains in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, whereas the average person at the bottom, where I think it's 12 or 13%, that's going to be peanuts, right? That's going to be practically without any effect whatsoever. So we've also got, he doesn't say anything more about carried interest, right? The way that the hedge fund hyenas get themselves a better rate by treating it as capital gains rather than wages, which is what it is. The most extreme that I can see is this question of the sweetheart rate for the overseas hoarders. I think that is just disgraceful, to coin a phrase. It's disgraceful. The idea being that somewhere between 2 to 3 to 5 trillion, as the candidate said, 5 trillion might have been hoarded in profits of U.S. corporations, which they have kept overseas. And the question is, what do you do with that? Well, you want them to repatriate those profits, because these are U.S.-based corporations, right? Trump doesn't seem to get upset about this. And I think that is, you deserve to notice this, right? That if you bring back, he says, if you bring back your profits that you hoarded overseas, then you will get a 10% sweetheart tax rate on that. You will be rewarded mightily. You won't have to pay 35% federal corporate income tax. You won't even have to pay 15%. You're going to pay 10%. And that 10% is lower than the rate in the lowest bracket. Right? I think the lowest bracket is 12% on Trump's brackets, right? In other words, the lowest income tax bracket, the 12% bracket. So the people who hoarded money overseas are going to get a better deal than the laboring person. Right? I think this is absolutely outrageous. The other one is, obviously, we should go through this thing about the child care, right? Since he made this so prominent in this thing. Trump wants to offer you 6 weeks of paid maternity leave, but only for women and only for 6 weeks. Whereas with Hillary, you get 12 weeks of maternity leave, and it can be a man or a woman, doesn't matter. Any person who's a parent or guardian of a child. Trump in the past had proposed increasing the standard deduction. Now, increasing the standard deduction is a very interesting idea. That's the way to give tax relief from the bottom up, by increasing the standard deduction so that people can shield more of their income. He once talked, I think, about a $50,000 standard deduction for married filing jointly, but that has now disappeared. It has disappeared because Trump is going over to the Ryan version. The House Republicans, the Freedom Caucus is getting their input into this. So forget about getting a better standard deduction or any significant tax relief. Now, here's the big one. Child care expenditures are deductible. But what does that presuppose? If you're earning $25,000 and your tax, your child care expenses are $20,000 or something big, you've got to have income that you can put on the front of your form, on the front of the 1040 form. You've got to show income, and then you can put a deduction from income. But if your income turns out to be only $10,000 or $15,000, and this is not unheard of, then that's going to be the absolute most that you can deduct on the front of the form. And of course, if you've got $5 million coming in, and if you hire nannies and fly all over the place, you can deduct all of that, and that's going to be a bonanza in terms of reducing your tax rate on the back of the form. We'll go through this again in a second on World Crisis Radio. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. Webster Tarpley here in Washington, D.C. Please do check out AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and subscribe either for the podcast or for the podcast plus the activism, and we'll be developing that as time goes on. So the economics. Notice, in order for the child care tax deduction to mean anything to you, first of all, You've got to itemize your deductions. Most people don't do that. Most people take the standard deduction, even though it's too low, because that's the best they can do. They're better off with the standard deduction than itemizing other things, and they don't get as much of a deduction that way on the form 1040 or whatever you have. You've got to have income. Right? Suppose you're completely broke, but you still have childcare expenses. You can't get anything back on that except a $1,200 allowance, and I'm not sure what this is, right? Whether that's a tax credit or a deduction. Even supposing it's a tax credit, that's not a whole lot. And you're going to get $500 to put in your rinky-dink child care savings account. Right? This is like health savings accounts. These are ways of saying you're going to have a few pennies in that account, and then you're on your own. The liability shifts to you, is what that means. Rinky-dink. So it's, tax-free money goes in, growth is tax-free, take it out, it's tax-free. That's all fine. But you got to have some money to put in it, and most people don't. So this is the child care tax deduction for the rich. And that's just the long and the short of it. Now, this idea, the trickle-down idea, the supply-side idea, right? This is, of course, Larry Kudlow, Art Laffer, he of the Laffer curve. This is Steve Moore. These guys, they were around for Reagan, and now they're back. So let's just see what happened with Reaganomics, right? The basic assumption is the Laffer curve, that if you lower tax rates, then revenue goes up. Is that what happened? Well, no. Let's go back to Ronald Reagan's first term, right? He comes in with a huge tax cut, which mainly benefits the wealthy. The top rate under Reagan, this was the great watershed in the decline of the U.S., that the top tax rate under Reagan went from 70% to 28%. It's a 42% tax cut. If you measure it that way, it's actually more, right? It's like a 2/3 cut, right? It's 66% or whatever it is, but from 70 to 28%, so 42 percentage points of reduction. And what did that do? That blew the lid off the federal deficit and therefore off the national debt. Under Reagan, the national debt went from $700 billion when he went in to $3 trillion when he left. So that's a 400%. Well, we can call it a 300%. I guess it depends on how you want to do the arithmetic. It's a 300% increase in the national debt. Reagan tripled the national debt with his tax cut from 70% to 28% for the rich. Those were two laws. The Kemp-Roth bill, which cut taxes in this way, and then that was embodied in a budget called Graham-Latta. So Kemp-Roth, Graham-Latta. And this then led to a huge ballooning deficit. So Reagan then had to roll back his own tax cuts by about a third in 1982. But here's the main thing he did. He decided to make the system more regressive and less progressive, right? Progressive tax would be 70% for the top rate. In other words, the richer you are, the bigger proportion you pay. That is fairness. That's what we've had since the New Deal. No, under voodoo economics, you've got to have shifting the burden to wage earners away from the super rich investors and so forth. And the way he did it was, with the help of Alan Greenspan, they began to stoke the hysteria that Social Security was going to run out of money. This is, if people believe that today, it comes from Reagan and Greenspan in those years, 81, 82, 83. So finally what happened was a reform, a ripoff of Social Security in 1983, which raised the Social Security payroll tax from about 9.5% to, as far as I can tell, almost 12%. So what? Call that a 2.3 to 2.5% increase in the payroll tax. But this is something that literally everybody pays. And over a few years, they got $2.5 trillion, let's say, out of this. And they used that money to run the government. So they cut the top rate from 70 to 28. So the rich could get their tax cuts for the rich, and the trickle down could happen. And then at the same time, the working people got stiffed by raising the Social Security payroll tax, which is inescapable, right? There's no way you can offset it. You're going to pay it. It's deducted. You'll never see it. From 9.5% to almost 12%. So again, call that a 2.5 or almost 2.5% increase, to the best of my ability to determine at this point. Reagan had tried to cut Social Security benefits originally, but he found that was politically not feasible. And this, the third rail, just as Bush, the younger George W. Bush, tried to cut Social Security benefits there in 2004, right? Privatizing and convoying all that money as commissions into the pockets of the Wall Street rich. Then there was later on Senor Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, let's also rip you off by, instead of getting the full benefit at 65, which had been the case, let's make you wait until you're 67. This is the same late Senator Moynihan who said in 1986, anybody but Tarpley, when it came to the U.S. Senate seat that year, and who should try to defeat Senator D'Amato. And what came out of this whole Reagan thing? Well, we've just said the tripling of the national debt and a bubble economy leading to the crash of 1987, which then led to a real estate crash and a terrible situation for the U.S. economy. So after 4 years of a Republican, right? After 4 years of Reagan, we had a bubble, and then we had the panic of 1987. And after 4 years of George W. Bush, we had a bubble and the panic of 2008. How about that? So that's some idea of what's happening. Elizabeth Warren now says that she has criminal referrals from the original investigations, I believe under Bush in 2008, concerning the activities of Wall Street banks. And Elizabeth Warren, pay attention to this. She's out there saying that she's writing to Director Comey of the FBI and the Justice Department saying, look, Comey, the FBI didn't used to comment, but now you have to, because you've done it for Hillary Clinton, against her, whatever. You got up there and gave that big scolding lecture, even though there was no indictment. So now you've got to tell us, because there's intense public interest, what happened to those criminal referrals concerning top bankers. The London Economist says that we are in a post-truth campaign. No, we can't be, because that's post-reality, and that means myth, and that is doom. Back in a minute. Welcome to the final segment of World Crisis Radio. Here we are. It's the 16th of September, Friday, 2016. And we're wrapping up here in the thick of the campaign. In coming episodes, especially this week on the American System, AmericanSystem.tv, we're going to be reporting on certain of the Senate campaigns. I think we're going to do Portman of Ohio this week, why he does not deserve re-election. We have done Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire, does not deserve, and Toomey of Pennsylvania does not deserve re-election, right? And we've pretty much shown that, I think. We're also going to keep our focus on the Sullivan versus New York Times decision of 1964, and there's even the Lochner decision, right? Let's start talking about the Lochner decision of the Supreme Court, 1905, which says that because of the 14th Amendment, you can't regulate wages, hours, contracts, and all that, right? That's crazy. And we're going to highlight the dissenting opinion of Oliver Wendell Holmes, considered sometimes to be the most famous dissent in Supreme Court history. But concerning Sullivan, we want to let you hear the concurring but separate opinions of Justice Arthur Goldberg and another one from William O. Douglas and one other justice. Now, got to do some foreign stuff other than Syria. How about Europe? Will the British leave the European Union? Will they? Well, maybe they won't. Look, this is an offbeat publication here. Princeton Alumni Weekly, September 14th, 2016, paw.princeton.edu. And here we have a very interesting guy, Professor Andrew Moravcsik, Moravcsik, Professor of Politics, International Affairs at the Woodrow Wilson School and Director of the European Union Program. So his thesis is that the European Union is the Hotel California. You can check out, but you can never leave. And the idea is, think of it like this, that the links are objectively too strong to be broken. I would compare this to 1815, right? After the Napoleonic Wars, all of the kings and queens were restored, right, more or less. But they could not be restored in every way. There were lots of things that could never be rolled back, right? And they just had to live with it because the world had moved on, right? The power of objective reality was that you couldn't go home again, right? You couldn't roll it back to what it was, 1770 or 1780. So this is what Moravcsik says. Under no circumstances will Britain actually leave Europe. London may seek to change its formal status, but its best option is to renegotiate the terms of EU membership. There's also the option, which is less desirable in his view, of accepting the European Union rules without being able to contribute, to have input into them. And that would be to negotiate an associate status resembling Norway or Switzerland. In other words, if you want to have access to the European single market, you've got to follow those rules. And once you follow the rules, you've put yourself under the EU rules. So why not be a member and be able to influence them? The European Union takes 45% of British exports. There are 1.3 million Britons who live on the continent, and the EU is giving them their medical care, their voting, their residency, their employment. There are 3 million Europeans in Britain, and they are essential to the economy. We've also got 70% of the UK immigrants who are non-European, right? Empire. Their status will not change. The British participate in the European arrangements on crime, human trafficking, illegal immigration, terrorism. They share data. This was the handiwork of Theresa May. She used to be the Home Secretary or Police Minister. Now she's the head of the government, Prime Minister. Cooperative scientific research, student exchanges. A lot of it comes from the EU. Britain would have to kick in, as do Switzerland and Norway. The British have little to gain. They've already exempted themselves from most of the stuff about the EU they don't like. Let's hear what that is. The euro, they're not in it. Schengen, no borders, they're not in it. All the social, employment, and immigration policies, right? Stuff like a minimum wage and things like that. No, the British don't want that. Britain is small compared to the EU, and it lacks the bargaining power. So here's what this professor predicts. He says the ministers who dominate the government, including Prime Minister May, are people who wanted to stay in the EU. Oh, they're all running around saying Brexit means Brexit. Maybe not, huh? Britain is delaying the launch of the negotiations, right? They have not invoked that treaty item that would lead to their exit within 2 years. How about this? The government is likely to muddle through for up to 5 years until a combination of public forgetfulness and buyer's remorse permits a compromise with Europe. And now here's a cynical codicil to all this. This is not speculation. 6 times referenda in the EU have essentially tried to roll back big European policies. You remember, 2005? France and the Netherlands said, we don't want this way of running the government. It was oligarchical for sure. Anyway, the referendum lost in France and the Netherlands, and then the European Commission turned around and made it into a treaty among governments, and that became the Lisbon Treaty. Greece tried to override the EU, failed. Denmark failed. Ireland failed twice. The outcome was eventually reversed with little public outcry. The truth is that the positive benefits of European policy are simply indispensable to a modern, interdependent nation. Now, I don't know if I can sign on to all of this, but it is certainly intriguing, right? It is I think there are elements of realism in here which are undeniable. In other words, the commodity flows, the economic connections, the communications connections, the logic of territory and ports and all the rest of this, right? These are all factors that essentially say stay in the European Union, right? And what do you have on the other side? Well, you have a 2 to 3% margin on some random afternoon in in the springtime or early summer of 2016 saying get out, right? That is inconceivable. If you had this in the United States, it would require a constitutional amendment. It would have to be voted on by the Congress. It would have, 2/3 majorities. It would have to be passed by 2/3 of the states within a certain period of time, but it would not be simply an odd vote, right? About, whether certain people got up on the right side of the bed or not. And this also puts this whole, alt-right, this crazy, libertarian view that somehow the Brexit is this, tremendous act of freedom and self-determination, and that the globalists have been defeated. It's very likely to be so unworkable. And again, people are going to say, well, what's going to happen to these people, right? The 1.3 million British who live on the continent. What about the 3 million Europeans, EU, in the US, right? Or in the UK? Remember Poland, right? A lot of this comes from Poland. Right now there's a crisis in Poland because they're afraid that the people are going to be kicked out of Britain and sent back. And that would be a disaster for both countries. So it's an outburst of rage and anger and being duped that can well be rolled back. So thanks very much to Professor Andrew Moravchik of the Woodrow Wilson School. I don't buy all of it, but food for thought here on World Crisis Radio. Remember, all week, AmericanSystem.tv, AmericanSystem.tv, and we'll see you here next week on World Crisis Radio.